Hello and welcome to the Two Trees Podcast. We're here to talk about angels and demons, ghosts, the pagan gods, and the weird corners of the Bible. We're talking about the beliefs of the ancient world, the way that they talked about the supernatural world, all to help you understand the people of the Bible and be able to engage on a deeper level with the text of Scripture. Most importantly of all, though, we're here to show you Jesus. As Deuteronomy 10:17 describes him, the Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, mighty and awesome. My name is Martin Listener, and I'm the brand new host of the Two Trees Podcast, all by myself. John Dillon is no...
Hi, John.
No, I thought you were doing good. Let it roll, buddy.
John is here, that's for sure.
I am here.
Rose is going to tell you a very important thing of what you need to do with this podcast.
Yes, this is a public service announcement. We would like you to leave a review on whatever platform you are using, share an episode with your friend, talk about it, and say, hey, have you ever heard of this really cool podcast that talks about... Okay, really quick. We talk about ghosts. Have we ever talked about ghosts?
The
Sure
pagan
have.
gods.
Man, I should
This was in the premolar stage of the podcast.
premolar. Is there such a thing?
Oh, yeah.
Is that like
All right.
incisors?
No, it's the
Baby
German
teeth.
spelling.
Yeah, it's the baby teeth
okay,
version
never
of the podcast. Anyway, so yeah, if you need to if you're like, hey, you know what? You need to hear some more about these weird corners of the Bible, go tell a friend. Share a link with them and let them know what we're doing over here.
And something Jacob used... You remember Jacob? He
I've
used
heard
to
of
be-
him.
Yeah, I think he used to be on this show from time to time. We'll have to make sure that happens again. But for real, if you want to listen to this and then discuss it with some people that you know from church, from down the street, from wherever, it's a great way to start talking about these things a little bit more and realistically open my eyes to a lot of different things that are in the Bible that you may not think of. So it's a good thing not to just tell people to listen to it, but then go back with them and see what they had to say and then tell us what you thought about it, too.
I like
It'd be
it.
Great.
I like it. Well, I am here with Rose and Jeremy and also Martin Listener. And this is our third time trying to record this introduction because a chicken keeps getting into the room and being a chicken. And so that may sound like a totally made-up thing, and maybe you don't struggle with that, but if you've ever tried recording with an angry chicken, it is difficult.
Actually, he wasn't angry. He looked invested.
I would say more curious.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think if he'd had a microphone, he would have jumped
He
right on.
would have.
He got up on the table. He was ready to go. It had to change, though.
I've told everybody from the beginning that chicken is evil.
I think he's a nice chicken.
No, there's something about him. I'm telling you. Ever since he attacked me that one day we were here swimming, I can't look at him
Define
the same.
attacked.
I think he was snuggling.
Guys, I hate to say this, but that's a girl. Like, that's not a rooster. That's a girl chicken.
Oh,
Well,
we call it he, don't we?
You did call
Its
it.
name
Name
is
is Bob.
Bobby. Bobette.
Anyway, so we've been discussing the idea of supernatural beings, the residents of the supernatural world. And for most people, that includes angels and demons, and that's the extent of the list. But if you are reading the Bible, you're going to find that there are other beings in the biblical narrative. One of the most ferocious of them are called cherubim. And our conversation today is going to play off of that idea of cherubim, but it is of a different word that's used, a descriptor of a being called a seraphim. And seraphim is... oh man, it is a black hole of wonderful, wonderful things to study and read. And we have been reading and studying this, and I'm a little nervous about presenting this because it's kind of out of the box for a lot of people. And so maybe that makes it go well, and maybe it doesn't. But if you're going to understand seraphim, you have to begin the conversation, I think, with understanding what the ancient peoples meant when they saw a serpent, when they put serpents in their artwork, when they put serpents in people's names, because to us, modern Western readers, the word serpent conjures up only one image, and that's of the Garden of Eden, where Satan is described as a serpent. But serpents are all through the Bible, and typically in ancient culture, serpents are associated with the supernatural world, with a protector, a being, a spirit that was a protector, a supernatural guardian of some kind. And most commonly, it's known by modern people by the image of the Pharaoh and his hat. If you ever take his headwear,
not a
right?
hat.
It's a hat. He's got this really cool little crown thing that has a serpent. Crown thing is better.
Crown thing is not better, but I felt a little bad about jumping on about hat.
Well, you're a mean person, Rose, so
Yeah.
people
Sorry
expect
about
that from you.
Actually, I have a quick question. You say that serpents are all through the Bible. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but can you give me, just off the top of your
Every
head...
example in the Bible.
every single one. Yeah, no.
Every single one?
Let's just go with
No,
two.
but we will use some. Well, the Genesis 3 is the first instance of it.
Gotcha.
You're then going to find it throughout the idea of Joseph, or rather of Jacob being the heel grabber. That connects to the idea of
The
stomping.
heel grabber. Yeah, good one.
And then on to like the dragon imagery that's in the book of Revelation, that of a winged serpent.
Jesus being lifted up. Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk
You're
about
right.
some of these, but
Okay.
it moves through the
Thank you.
entire canon of Scripture. The Egyptians made a tremendous use of the image of a serpent, the idea that there was a spirit guarding this place, and they called it the Urias. It's a Greek word for what they called it. And it was really popular to put on the walls, and it meant, watch out. Don't mess around here. Just like a cherub would have been placed at the gates or perhaps at the throne, the seraphim or images like them was very much a part of Egyptian culture. And it wasn't only used by the Egyptians, but it was picked up by people who had a lot of dealings with the Egyptians. For instance, ancient Israel. We know that the seals of many ancient Israelite politicians have winged serpent images. And this word there for the winged serpent, the Urias or Urias, is a picture, not of what it looked like, but of what this spirit represented. It was a power. It was a spirit that guarded things. And in the Bible, you'll find usually the word for serpent is the word nakash. Nakash is the word that you're going to find in the beginning of Genesis. It says the nakash is there. And it means a serpent. So when you see the word nakash as a noun, you're going to translate that as serpent. But if you use the word nakash as a verb, the meaning changes from serpent to wizard or magical practitioner, a diviner. If you're using it like an adjective, as a word that describes something, it doesn't mean serpent, it means a burning one, like a cobra would spit poison and it would burn and bring about death. And so the image of the serpent brought all of these ideas into play. When you saw something was a serpent, it wasn't necessarily evil, but it was a clear-cut indication that what we're talking about is a supernatural being.
So, John, I want to jump in real fast. You're talking about protector or something that would defend or have strong defense. What would bring the serpent to the top of that list? I know you mentioned about maybe having venom or something that they could spit, but to me, it's not really an apex predator. I'm trying to put myself in the mind of those in the ancient world, but today we know so many different animals, I think, that could take out a snake pretty easily.
Oh, sure, but a snake is an unseen danger. It's something incredibly powerful that isn't obvious like an elephant or a horse or something
like the
big like
expression
that.
snake in the grass.
It's deadly and unseen. It also has the ability to heal itself. The fact that they were changing their skin is something that is weird. And when ancient people saw that, they began to think, well, maybe this is a being that has a connection to the gods of healing. And so you find later on the Greeks were worshiping a god called Asclepius, who was visualized as a serpent or someone carrying a serpent. But you find this all through the Bible, and it begins with the Egyptian iconography, the Egyptian art. And, go ahead.
No, I was actually going to, very undeveloped thought. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Eustace is a dragon, and he tries to heal himself by shedding his own skin, and he cannot do that. And
Right.
Aslan has to come and peel it off of him.
That's right.
It's not possible for Asclepius to heal himself.
And so
It's
what
a-
you have
yeah.
Lewis doing there is picking up the biblical
Right.
motif. He's thinking like an ancient person and talking about it in a way that modern people would understand.
He is no dummy, let's just say.
No, I like that
Lewis
fellow.
is a good man, yeah.
But for instance, when you read the book of Exodus, we find that Moses and Aaron walk into the throne room of Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 7. Exodus 7, 1 through 13. We're not going to read this, but I'll tell you the story. But Moses walks in and he makes a sign. So, Pharaoh asks, who is God that we should worship him? And no doubt Pharaoh would have been incredibly familiar with the symbol of the uraeus, the winged serpent. Like a cobra has flares on the side of its head. Ancient peoples called those its wings, and in imagery they exaggerate those into full-out wings. And then they would add multiple wings, so you really got the idea, okay, this is not a normal snake. But when Moses walks into the room and he throws down his staff and it becomes a serpent, this serpent is a picture of the power of God. It's not a picture of evil. It's not a picture of Satan. It's not a picture of the tempter. It's an image of the power of God. And Moses would have understood that because he grew up in Egypt. Now, the interesting thing to me that happens then is that the two magicians, again, that word there is like someone who is a serpent, those who practice magic, the Nakash, they also come in and they throw down their staffs, and what do?
Turn into a serpent.
They turn into serpents. So now you have a battle of supernatural beings, of one Nakash versus another. But to the modern reader, many Christians just think serpent bad. And so then we get confused. Why does God choose the serpent to be a picture of his power in the Moses story? And so the entire imagery here is no one would have been surprised to learn that there were supernatural things happening in Pharaoh's courtroom, because to them, that is obviously where the supernatural beings were hanging out. When you read the Garden of Eden, who is it that is in the tree and tempting Eve? It's a serpent. When they're wandering in the wilderness, Moses has this staff that he brings out, and he says, look to this serpent. And that word is seraph. And he says, this is a fiery serpent that you've made. Look to this and you'll be saved. It's a picture of God's salvation. And probably the most beautiful illustration of this happens in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verses 6 through 16, where Jesus describes himself, and he says, just like the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up. And so Jesus is saying, I am like the serpent, not the serpent from the Garden of Eden, but the serpent from the wilderness, where God's power was shown, and the salvation of the people was made visible and made present through the image of the serpent. This drives people nuts, because we don't like to think of a serpent as anything other than something evil. And in the Bible, seraphim are described as serpent-like. Go ahead.
This is like a super obvious question, and I'm racking my brain to remember. So far we've done angels as messengers, cherubim as guardians. I feel like we should do a previously on the Two Trees podcast,
yes.
like beginning. So when we get to seraphim and serpents, I mean, was Satan a seraphim?
We don't know.
I know, but I mean, it just feels like such an obvious connection.
So I'm going to go on the record here and say, officially, I do not know if there is even a difference between cherubim and seraphim.
Wow.
I have tried really hard to figure this out.
I was like, I got to fill the space here with a wow.
I don't know what it is. I don't know if they're the same being described in different ways. And I'm actually going to draw attention to this as the podcast rolls along. I think they are describing the same beings, but it's different words, and the descriptions of them are wildly different. And I'm going to try to draw our attention to
physically.
it. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they physically and even their functions. So, I mean, it feels like there's a difference.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is it though? Because if we're wrong, then that's not good.
So a seraphim is a guardian spirit. A cherubim is a guardian spirit.
Are they guarding different things, in your humble opinion?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know. But
wow.
I know that their function seems to be incredibly similar. Cherubim are definitely a word that's used in the Bible, and they're creature-like. Seraphim also seem to be creature-like. The problem comes is that when we read the Bible and we see this description of a cherub, we see what it looks like. We want that to be video footage, and it isn't. It's a metaphor, it's a symbol, it's a supernatural event happening. And these beings are being described in terms that we can understand. It isn't video footage. It's a way of showing and not telling. We still do this in our culture. For instance, if you were to read a piece of political satire and there's an elephant behind a desk, you understand that's talking about the Republican Party, but it's not describing what Republicans look like. If there's a donkey, it's a picture of the Democratic Party. It's not what they look like, but this thing represents the others. It's not intended to give you a scientific classification, kingdom, phylum, class, order, all those things that we do in zoology. It doesn't work that way that I know of into the supernatural world. When you're in the world of visions, things can be more than they appear or different than they appear. Give thought to King Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. When he has a dream, God shows him this dream, and he is a tree. That doesn't look anything like Nebuchadnezzar. Alexander the Great is described as a goat with a horn. The Persian Empire is described as a ram with one horn bigger than the other, or as a bear with a hunched back and one shoulder is up higher than the other. These are descriptions of physical things, but if you get locked in a literal reading of these things, you will miss that it is more and not less than the description.
I have a small connection here. One time, Jeremy and I were going through just a really stifling and terrible time. And I had a dream one night. Yes, this is a dream, guys. It's like everybody wants to hear everybody's dreams, right? Just like they want to look at their vacation pictures. Not really. But in the dream, there was a giant airplane, like the kind that take off from Wright Pat. And it was coming through the sky and getting ready to crash. And I could tell it was coming towards our house. And I just wanted to go get the kids, and I wanted to go get out of there. And I knew no matter what happened, I couldn't get away from it, and it was literally a nightmare. And I mean, in our life, do we really have an airplane, a giant, Air Force thing, like getting ready to crash on our house? No, we didn't. But it felt like that, And so that to me is a small connection to what you're talking about. It's like this, it's like a this, it's like a that, but it's not those things. It's just what it evokes. It's strong like a lion. Right. It's swift like an eagle or whatever.
And so what you have there, the cherubim, the cherub is the Mesopotamian or Babylonian word there for that we get the word cherubim from. They're covered in eyes, right? They have a face like a lion, a face like an eagle. You've got all these different creatures that are described, and they're beast-like. And when you look at Babylonian culture, that's how they expressed their belief in guardian spirits. The imagery of Babylon was that of a bull-like figure with different animal heads. And that existed in Egypt a little bit with the idea of the Sphinx, but the most common image that they used was that of the serpent, and it has an incredibly similar meaning. And so what I'm asking us to do here is not to drag our thinking of a snake into the story, but to instead bring the ancient beliefs of the snakes into the story. How does knowing how they thought about these things show us what the symbolism of the visions may be intending to say? In the Bible Project, Tim Mackey has just started a series on dragons in Scripture, and it's super good. There's one episode out right now. If you haven't listened to it, you totally should. It's great. But he has a quote in there that I thought was great. It says, "Symbolic imaginations merge visual symbols with their meanings. Different looking visual pictures can invoke the same exact ideas." So something can look like a tree and be a king. Something can look like a dragon and be a king. Something can look like one thing and really be representing another thing. It isn't as though this is video footage and now I have to believe that it looks exactly this way or I'm disbelieving the Bible. A spirit is by its very nature non-physical. It doesn't look like something. It's an entirely different type of experiencing the world. And so when God is giving a vision of his presence to Ezekiel, and he describes him as surrounded by these beings, and there are wheels covered in eyes, and these throne guardians are out there with their many faces, they understood what that meant. This is a throne guardian. These are the creatures who are in the presence of the divine. And they picked that up because it made sense in their culture. Martin, you look like you're chewing on something.
Oh, a lot. I don't know where to jump in. I'm just trying to think of that idea, like you mentioned. It's not video footage. It's not a description of what they look like, because perhaps they didn't even have a form. That to me is what I'm trying to get through my head, is we're trying to put a form on these formless beings, perhaps. And so you're talking about, what they look like, but really you're just describing the attributes that they have.
I think that's true.
You're not looking at their physical appearance. I'm not trying to
describe their physical appearance, because they're a spirit.
And
I'm describing their nature.
The only thing that I can even try to put together is like when you're doing a draft, you look in the NFL, they talk about the players by what they can do, like how big their hands are, how high they can jump, how far they can do this. And you would say things like, man, he's like a cheetah because he's really fast, or he, jumps like a kangaroo. Well, he doesn't look like a kangaroo or a cheetah, but you have the understanding that, man, this guy's fast, or he can jump really high, or he's strong like an ox. Like, he doesn't have horns and 4 legs. He's not an ox, but he's strong like one. And so we can put that together. And then if you were to see a picture of this guy, you'd be like, oh, he doesn't have cheetah legs and an ox head? Like, what's going on? But it'd be the same idea. The scout knows and can portray to the people, the coach and everybody that's watching, what this guy is like, not what he looks like.
Yeah, and ancient peoples were really comfortable with this idea of the gods or the supernatural beings appearing in different forms. They got more comfortable with this as they went on. The Greeks, in particular, went nuts with this. Zeus was appearing as whatever he felt like appearing. In one story, he's rain. In another story, he's a cow. It's this idea that...
Wait, was he a cow, or was he in love with a cow?
He was in love with a cow.
Okay.
And that's going to come into play, actually, in our study of the Seraphim.
Sorry. Yeah, okay.
But the word Seraphim is predominantly taken into our culture from the book, not of Ezekiel, but the book of Isaiah. And it's a different word for snake. Nakash is the word for serpent. Seraph means fiery serpent, or the burning, destroying serpent, the image of a cobra, which is an Egyptian image. The world of Isaiah was very familiar with Egyptian iconography, with Egyptian symbols. The world of Ezekiel, where they're in captivity, is very familiar with Babylonian imagery. And so when God spoke to the people of Israel, I think he did it in a way that made sense to them in the culture where they were, that made sense to them. They saw this. Ancient Israelites were using this image on their seals because they had a close association with Egypt. But when they went into exile in Babylon, they didn't have the close relationship with Egypt. Now that generation has grown up with Babylonian iconography. And it's described in the book of Ezekiel in a typically Babylonian way.
I do have a question there. Earlier, when you said the Israeli politicians had the seal, what era would you be talking about? Like divided kingdom and after?
Yeah, I don't know that we have any seals from before the time of Solomon. That would be really cool if we did.
Yeah.
I'll post some pictures on the Facebook, and you guys can see some of these, or you can just look them up online. They're not uncommon, and they look very Egyptian. And if they hadn't found them in Israel much later than when the Egyptians were ruling Canaan, you would think, oh, this makes sense. These groups were interacting with each other. And so you'll find the word seraph used in the book of Numbers and in the book of Deuteronomy. Numbers 21, verse 6, and Deuteronomy 8 both describe the instance where God plagues Egypt, or plagues Israel, with poisonous, fiery serpents. Fiery there meaning the idea of poisonous. Not that they're made of fire, but they burn like fire. And then they lift up a image of one on a pole. And Jesus uses this image to say, just like that serpent was lifted up, so I will be lifted up. And so if you're going to understand the power of Jesus' statement, you need to understand the background that Jesus and Nicodemus both shared. And that was they knew that the serpent wasn't only a negative image.
This is a really good case to read the Old Testament. I know that one time I was young, my dad and I were taking a walk, and I remember saying, like, I don't even know why you need to read the Old Testament. And he said, have you ever heard of creation? And I was like, well, yeah. He said, well, where did you read that? And I said, in the Old Testament, obviously. He's like, if you didn't read the Old Testament, you would never know about the creation, so start there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and since then, I've thought about it so many times. Every time I read something in the New Testament, it's tied to the Old Testament, just like what you just described.
Yeah, they're not different. They're expressions of the same thing. My board is freaking out a little bit. I'm not sure why I did that. Let's take a look at one of the passages where we find the word seraphim. I'm not touching that. Why is it doing that? We'll turn it down.
There you go.
Let's look at Isaiah 30, verses 6 through 7. Jeremy, you've been quiet over there, but I will allow you to be quiet no longer. Read this for us.
An oracle on the beast of the
Negev.
through a land of trouble and anguish, from where the lioness and the lion, the adder and the flying fiery serpent, they carry their riches on the backs of donkeys, and their treasures on the humps of camels, to a people that cannot profit them. Egypt's help is worthless and empty. Therefore I have called her Rahab, who sits still.
All right, we're going to stop right there. 7 verses, or 6 and 7 here. And this is a way of describing the beasts of the Negev. Do you remember when we were in the Negev down at Beersheba?
I do.
It's not the kind of place that's really lush and green. It's a place that's wide open. It's also the kind of place you would find snakes. It's the kind of place where lions were seen. This is the wilderness. And so when Isaiah is talking about judgment of the peoples who are dwelling in the Negev, he describes them in demonic terms as lioness and the lion, creatures that wander in the darkness. And then it does something really strange. It says they're also like the adder and the flying, fiery serpent. There are no flying serpents in the Negev, nor have there ever been any flying serpents in the Negev.
Never, ever.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, that's it. I was just, when he was reading that, I was looking at it, and I was trying to picture what a flying fiery serpent would look like, and I do not like the image.
Are there winged serpents in the desert, though?
I have no idea.
There are.
I didn't see any.
Well,
but
cobras in the ancient
Yeah.
times were there. They're a winged serpent. That image there doesn't just mean a physical being. It also is a picture of the supernatural world. And the Bible talks about the demonic world in terms of creatures of the wilderness, lions, owls, jackals. These are ways of talking about the demonic world. And so here we find one of the instances, and there's not very many instances of the use seraphim in the Bible, but here it's talking about a serpent-like creature. It's not talking about a human-like creature. It's talking about a serpent, a flying, fiery serpent. And then it ends with Rahab. We're not going to get into Rahab on this episode, but it's fascinating.
Is this the Rahab? I know we're not getting into it, but is this the Rahab?
This is the Rahab.
the one and only.
The counterpart to Leviathan,
Okay.
which is a really cool, maybe we'll do an episode just
be
on
continued.
Rahab. Yeah,
Yeah.
we need to do that. But in the book of Isaiah, earlier in the book, it also uses the word seraphim. And let's look at Isaiah 14, 28 through 31. Rose, would you read that?
In the year that King Ahaz died came this oracle. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. And the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety. But I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you. For smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks.
So this is a woe on the cities of the Philistines. And the Philistines were pretty much wiped out by armies from the north. This prophecy came true. And so when it wants to describe the Philistine people, it says, rejoice not, Philistia, because the rod that struck you so hard it broke. For the serpent's root will come forth an adder, And out of that root, it is a fruit. It will be a flying, fiery serpent, the winged snake. That's the word seraphim. And it's describing them. Again, it says, Philistines, the judgment that's coming on you is going to be like finding and being surprised by a cobra. 1 minute, everything's fine. The next minute, you're looking at death. This is coming for you fast, as though it's on wings. And it begins with this really interesting little introduction. In the year that King Ahaz died. This is almost, you can just about tell that Isaiah wrote this. He likes this little line. Mm-hmm. But it is unique to Isaiah's idea here. It's repeated again in the most famous of all of the Seraphim texts. And that comes from Isaiah 6. And so I want to rehash just before we get going here and to say this. Serpents are not the bad guys in Scripture. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. Moses uses them. God inspired this, and there are instances where a supernatural being is referenced by the image of a serpent. Finding a serpent on a wall was a way that people would talk about a supernatural being is here, like a beware of the dog sign. This is under the protection of something.
So that's what I was just about to say, John. I think maybe the misconception comes because every time you see or hear about these fiery serpents or any type of serpent, something bad is about to happen. And it may not be unrighteous, but it's not good. Someone may be dying here soon or at least being beat up and thrown out the door. So there's always a negative action that happens, which could be in a way of righteousness. I mean, you talk about Moses, when he brought forth the snake, it ate the other two.
Because God is judging Egypt and the gods of Egypt.
But the action is not good. It's gruesome. It's gross. It's rough and tough.
Seraphim are not described as lovable, cuddleable beings in the same way that cherubim.
But people take that as a negative connotation towards them, like, oh my gosh, they're mindless creatures that all they know is destruction, right?
Well, I think it may be even worse than that. I think, Jeremy, you and I were talking about this, and when I told you that they were serpent-like, you told me, oh, I don't know about that, because in your mind, serpent meant Satan.
Yeah.
That idea goes all the way back. That's the image that is strongest in our minds. And Rose, you kind of alluded to this. When we do use, then, our Old Testament, we like to go right to the creation story and talk about evolution and creation. But the Torah is much bigger than that. And there are lots of stories throughout the Old Testament that don't get a lot of airtime. They don't get read so much.
Do you suppose that Satan basically gave serpents a bad name?
I think we could say that pretty confidently.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus said, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so will I be lifted up. Was he redeeming the serpent back, do you think?
In
is
a
that
way.
a bit of a stretch?
Yeah, that's a bit of a stretch.
It is a stretch, but...
Because I don't think it was completely negative in their minds. It is in ours, because we've limited the scope of the story to always being negative. An ancient person would have viewed a snake, a picture of a snake, as a reference to a supernatural being. That is something we've lost.
I think it's because we literally have serpents or snakes every day of our life. We do not have anything that looks like a cherubim milling around, but we have snakes. I mean, we found them in our wood pile, and it is frightening to go for a piece of wood and touch a snake instead, or walk or like slithering across your yard. Like, they do exist in our world, unlike angelic
they exist.
beings.
Oh yeah, but they existed in Egypt. They existed in Israel. They were used to this. But serpents become a picture of the demonic. One of my favorite stories is St. Patrick driving the serpents out of Ireland, because there are no snakes in Ireland. But the imagery of that story is more than just how we got rid of the vermin. It's symbolic of how St. Patrick brought Christianity and drove out the powers of darkness from this place.
So serpents can be, okay, follow me here. Angelic serpents can be good or bad. There's good ones and there's bad ones. Or
You can describe an angelic power as a serpent and not mean that it's evil.
Okay.
Just
Gotcha.
like you can describe the cherubim as a lion and not mean that it's evil. or as an ox and not mean that it's evil.
So when St. Patrick drove out the demons from Ireland or the serpents from Ireland, he was driving out bad guys. But there's good guys, serpents,
Yeah, I think so.
Seraphim.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I keep remembering what C.S. Lewis, I'm sorry, I feel like I reference him all the time, but he made a huge impact on me, guys.
That's why John
Like
keeps having you back, because you quote
Yeah,
C.S.
I know.
yeah.
Exactly. It's like, anyway, but he says that they're spoiled goodness. You know, that Lord created everything and said it's very good, and it's a rebellion. And so there can be rebellion in all ranks.
Yeah. So the word nakash for serpent can mean a magic wielder, a wizard. It can also mean a burning one, a glowing something on fire. It's a being, though. And so the Bible describes Satan once as a cherub and then describes him in supernatural terms as a serpent. I get the idea that I'm swimming in the deep end of the pool and I can't get my footing. I can't see into this world. I just know how the Bible talks about them. And so the Bible talks about cherubim and the Bible talks about seraphim. It uses different words, but it's describing a being whose job is to guard, to protect, to bring about judgment. And one of my favorite books is this is going to sound terrible, but it's super helpful. Dr. Heiser referenced it all the time. It is called the Dictionary of Deities and Demons. And in it gives a quote in the section on seraphim from 1 Enoch 71, verse 7. This is not scripture, but it gives an idea of how the Second Temple Jewish community were thinking about seraphim. And in it, it says in 1 Enoch 71, verse 7, it describes the cherubim, the ophanim, and the seraphim as the sleepless ones who guard the throne of his glory. This image of guarding something comes back into play. In Isaiah, the seraphim, the throne guardians, are described as serpent-like. In Ezekiel, they're described in Babylonian terms or Assyrian terms. And so when we go into Isaiah 6, we should have this understanding that the word seraph has already multiple times been used to refer to creepy crawly snakes. And it has also been used as a way of referencing supernatural powers who are dangerous. And so now let's read Isaiah 6, 1 through 7.
In the year that King Uzziah died.
All right, we're going to stop there. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
This is that same phrase. And so this is the same author, and he's talking, and now he's going to describe what he saw.
I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple.
Filled what?
The temple.
So Isaiah, who is a priest, is up on the Temple Mount, and suddenly he's in the supernatural world. He's not seeing the physical temple. He's seeing the supernatural reality behind it. How is he doing that? I don't know. God is enabling it to happen.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, he's not seeing a video here. This is the supernatural world is being made visible to him in a way that he can understand. The robe of the Lord fills the temple. That was a way of describing the glory of God. And he's high and he's lifted up. Read verse 2.
Above him stood the seraphim.
We have seen this word before, and it is used in terms to describe the burning snakes, the winged serpents, the cobra, the urias. This is the seraphim. This is not a word that comes out of nowhere for the ancient reader. It is a word that comes out of nowhere for an English reader, because this is not a word that's popped up in our translations before. They've translated it. Here is the same word that's used to describe the serpents in those previous texts. So what does it describe the seraphim as looking like?
Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke.
So this is a winged being, a serpent-like being with 6 wings. Just like the cherubim are described as beast-like, the seraphim here is described in terms of serpent-like appearance. The cherubim also have arms and hands, it's described. So do these. This is dragon-like in its description. Or perhaps a flashing bar of light that's winged. I don't know exactly what he saw, but what he saw he describes in this way. And they're calling out to the glory of God. They cover their face. So we don't know what their face looks like. They cover their feet, which may be a euphemism. And with two, they fly. And Isaiah sees this, and he loses it. He says, I'm a dead man. Woe is me, for I am undone. I'm lost, because I'm a sinner. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. Read that next line.
For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts.
Now, if you saw giant flying, flaming dragons, wouldn't that make you a little afraid?
But isn't it interesting that he doesn't care about them?
He does not care about them because he is overawed with the eyes that he sees. Instead, he sees the Lord.
Wow.
You want to know what God looks like? He looks in this as something that would make you not even notice the dragons, not even notice the seraphim. They're a side note because the Lord is glorious. The Lord is on his throne, and the Lord is speaking. Now, these beings have a tremendous voice. It says when they cried out, it shook the whole building. But now God is speaking. He's going to say that we can fix this. He has a message for Isaiah to take. But before that happens, one of the seraphim responds to Isaiah's problem. Read verse 6.
Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for.
Now, this seems to be priestly behavior. This is strange, guys. This is not straightforward. And if you just think, this is a bunch of six-winged people flying around, you have to ignore the words that Isaiah chooses to use. This snake has hands, and it's acting like a priest. It's protecting the Lord, it's praising the Lord, and it's caring for the people that are in his presence. This is not a robot. This is a being with its own intellect, its own will, its own understanding, and it's described for us in a way that ancient Israelites and ancient Egyptians would have recognized immediately, not as saying this thing looks like a snake, but as saying this is a supernatural being. This is a heavenly being.
That one's really throwing me off, where he touches his mouth. He says, Behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, there's only one way that your sin can be taken away, and that's with the death of Jesus. But this seems to be acting in the same manner as that, taking away the sins of Isaiah.
Well, what is Isaiah's problem? He says what? I have been doing what?
He has unclean lips.
I have unclean lips, and where am I living?
Amongst people with unclean lips.
So he's saying, I am ceremonially unclean. I should not be here. I should not most certainly be in the temple, let alone the supernatural reality of the temple. And so what happens here is something that Isaiah would have been familiar with as a priest. He is going through a ritual that makes him clean.
So he's not taking away his sin as far as
No.
paying the price for his
He's making
sin.
him clean. That's what Isaiah is shouting about here.
He's making
I'm
it so
unclean.
he's okay to be where he is.
The only thing that can take away, forgive sins is Jesus. And now Jesus is there on the throne. And
Well-
so I think this is Jesus taking care of all of this as well. But I say this to tell you that this is a wonderfully deep text. And if you get fascinated and fixated on what do seraphim look like, you're going to miss out on some beautifully deep conversations about how does Jesus deal with sin? Why is Jesus so beautiful that even flying creatures like that cover their face in his presence? This is to show you that he is the God of gods. He is a spirit. And there are other spirits too, but nothing like him. He is unmatched in his beauty. Does that make sense? Kind
Yeah,
of,
that's
maybe?
fascinating. No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with it, but it's amazing to me because that's something that I've been trying to, fight through or wrestle through recently with talking about how human beings can be like that. If you, there's been a thought that's been brought into my head that a human soul after being in the presence of God would be so magnificent that if we saw it, we would fall on our face.
A really great read about that is another C.S. Lewis book. It's actually a sermon, and it's called The Weight of Glory. It's marvelous, and it
so
talks about exactly what you're discussing.
This really nails that down, because it's like, here's another creature that has, just a skosh of the power that, Jesus has, Almighty. And it really puts it into perspective of like a ranking system. Like a human soul that's been in glory would be way too much for us to even handle. And then it's like, what about this winged creature that's been there for maybe all eternity?
Yeah, and this isn't an angel. It's a different thing entirely. An angel is a messenger. It's a job description. And this creature has much more in common with a cherubim. Possibly is a description of a cherubim with a different word used to describe it.
And yet there seems to be
there's this idea of humans that we're going to rule in the heavenlies.
Yeah.
That we who are the least will be elevated far above what we have any right to expect. That God has died for us and forgiven our sins. It says the angels desire to look into this. They're looking at like, surely not for those little dirt things down there running around.
Isn't it weird how they don't even comprehend why it's done that way? The angels that know so much more than us are so much more powerful than us, and they can't comprehend it, and yet we sit down here and be like, yeah, duh. Why wouldn't he do that? Like,
yeah, we're awesome, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Like, he should have done it earlier, really. So there's this idea that we
entitled.
But then again, it's like, how can we even understand what happened or why it happened? Because we have that jaded mentality of like, man, he should have died for us. Like, he kind of started it, right? And that's the Adam theory in the garden, where he says, if it was the woman that you gave me, that's the reason why I ate the apple. How often we blame God from that. And this is getting way off topic from here, but it's an interesting story that comes through with that.
No, I don't think it's off topic, because the presence of these beings is there to show you the power of God. These are his servants. And if the servants are this awe-inspiring, then the master is infinitely more so.
So do you think that the seraphim are preparing Isaiah for service?
I do.
Is that one of their functions, if you want to use such a clinical word? Because the next part, I mean, this isn't on here, but they say, who will go? And he's like, well, here am I, send me, and he's been prepared for that service.
And then he's given a really crappy message.
He has given a crappy message, but he's given some beautiful ones too. He got to proclaim the Messiah. Jesus quotes him, there's a lot there. And if he never would have been seeing the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and been prepared for service by the seraphim.
It's one of those moments where you see the whole of God's creation working in unity together. You have this Garden of Eden moment where the heavens
beautiful.
And the earth are together with a willing heart who doesn't pretend that he has no problems, but is humble and comes to God and says, Lord, I'm unworthy to be here. And the Lord doesn't squash him. He rescues him. He sends help. Now, these beings, cherubim and seraphim, have been fascinating things to read about for me. And I think for a lot of Christians, the idea of these beings has captured their imagination for a very long time. And I brought into discussion the idea that perhaps these are descriptions of the same thing that are being seen through the lens of different cultures. And I have one last text that I'd like to use as my backup for this. And if at the end of this you're like, nope, don't buy it, that's okay, we can still be friends, let's get coffee. I'm not going to die on this hill. I'm just telling you what I think. In the book of Revelation, we have another instance where there are creature-like beings around the throne of God. And they look like cherubim, and they look like seraphim, and yet they are their own thing. Look at Revelation chapter 4, verses 4 through 10. Rose, would you read that?
From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which were the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne.
This is beautifully described as a temple scene where the Lord is on his throne, and around the throne are 4 living creatures. I like that. There are 4 things that are living. What do they look like? They look freaky. They are described as a blend between the seraphim and the cherubim. These are not serpent-like, but they do have 6 wings, like the seraphim. These are not serpent-like, but they cry out, holy, 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 just like the seraphim do in the book of Isaiah. They look instead like the cherubim. They are covered in eyes. If you go back and you read the Ezekiel text, you'll find that the wheels around the cherubim, the ophanim, are described as covered in eyes. And they have the faces of the creatures that are given in the book of Ezekiel. Where did this idea of an upright being covered in eyes come from? I think, again, it has to do with the culture that John grew up in. There is a myth in ancient Greek and Roman culture of a giant called Argos Panopetes. He's a giant who's covered in eyes. And he's famous as a dragon slayer. He kills Echidna, the mother of monsters. And he's given a job by the goddess Hera to protect a cow named Io, and he ties her to an olive tree. The idea was that this guy is covered in eyes. He is the best guardian. He's the best protector because he can see forwards, backwards, sideways, all these things. And this is how the Romans and the Greeks thought of describing someone ever vigilant. Panopetes, I think is how you say that, Argus. Now, we told you before that Zeus fell in love with a cow. This is the cow, or the heifer. And so you kind of get an idea. This giant is killed.
Yeah, Hera was kind of messing with Zeus when she wanted this cow protected. Like, she knew it was a mistress. Zeus was a whole bag of mistakes.
Messed upness.
Yeah. Right.
But it's interesting to me that John, who lives in a Greek and a Roman world, is given a vision of these throne guardians in a way that the Roman and the Greek people would have understood as a supernatural guardian.
Do you think this part earlier from the book of Enoch, where it says the sleepless ones who guard the throne of his glory, and then they're covered with eyes, is that where the sleepless part comes in?
I think so.
I mean, if you have that many eyes, I think in the myth maybe like...
Some of his eyes went to sleep.
Yeah,
and
some
others
could go to
stayed awake.
sleep while some stayed awake. Like, that's the whole point of having all the eyes or something like that. It's been a while. But, yeah, that's interesting. It makes me wonder how much of it the ancient myths ripped off of truth, or how much the writer sets it in a cultural setting so people can understand. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, and I don't know the answer. I think, though, that when you come away from this, even if you don't buy the Argus thing, I'm just saying it's similar.
I don't buy the Argus thing.
No, I think it's a being covered in eyes. He's a guardian. These beings that are described in Revelation are covered in eyes. It's the only time this happens in the Bible.
I'm fine with it being in the Bible, but I'm not going to pretend like these petty gods of the Greeks and Romans have any, like, screen time in my life.
No, that's
like,
fine.
they're just, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, John, you mentioned a lot about culture in this episode, and a lot over the last couple about the culture that the person was in is how they viewed these spiritual beings. If I go to sleep tonight and God decides to give me a vision similar to what John had or what Isaiah had or any of these, am I going to see these creatures as the thing I put on top of my Christmas tree?
Oh, I hope not.
Which would be the culture that I would be accustomed to. Or
Yeah.
would I see
so
it
what
like
I'm saying with the Argus thing is that when the Bible describes these beings again, it does them in culturally appropriate language. I'm not saying that seraphim are Argus or that Argus is a seraphim. I'm saying that why has the description changed? Because
Sure.
I don't think like this is the cherub in its, it molted its skin and then now it looks like this. They're growing. We don't have any indication of that.
But we have indicated that God has, or at least the writer has described what he saw in a way that people would be able to understand it.
Yes.
Due to the culture that they're in.
And when you read, for instance, Ezekiel, one of the phrases that keeps coming up over and over again is, "It was like." It was like.
So
He
if I were to get
struggles with words to describe what he saw.
If I were to get a vision from God tonight, when I lay down, or any time in the next near future, with that, I would see the exact same thing that these guys saw.
I don't know. I think God would present to you whatever was needed to make you understand what he was showing you.
I guess ultimately what I'm trying to get is are these things the same no matter who sees them? It's just we have no way of describing them other than what we can get from our culture that we're in.
Yeah, I think so. I used to be really into this is what they look like. This is a zoological species of being that exists in the heavens. And I do think there is a distinction. But what I'm saying is that there is not nearly the distinction between cherubim and seraphim that I thought there were.
Ultimately, if you look at, say, a crime scene for a chance, and I'm an eyewitness and Rose is an eyewitness, we're both going to say what happened differently. We're going to describe it differently because either we have a different point of view or we have a different background, so we're going to use different descriptions of what happened. But what actually is there is the same for both of us.
I mean, for instance, I feel like chickens are fine. Like they're neutral.
And
They're even maybe
I
our
would say they're
friends.
serpents.
And you think they're frightening creatures.
But again, the chicken is the same chicken.
Right.
And that's it. So the
There
seraphim
is-
are the same.
Yes.
No matter who sees them, it's just they are describing them with words that make sense to them and the people that are around
There
them.
is a supernatural reality that is a cherubim, that is a seraphim. And they are described in visions in ways that humans can see without their brain shorting out. And it seems to be done differently at different times depending on the culture. There are instances of beings covered in eyes in the Greco-Roman world. When John sees it, this doesn't come out of nowhere. That image had a meaning to people. When Ezekiel saw cherubim pulling the chariot of God and describes them as beast-like with 4 faces, that image is something that someone living in ancient Babylon would have understood.
So is it also a little bit, I feel like we've talked about this before, but it might have just been in a different conversation. Like when John in Revelation sees, I think it's Christ, and he says his eyes are like a flame of fire and his hair is white like. Well, there's things like they're trying to use earthly, descriptions for a heavenly thing or a spiritual thing.
And sometimes Jesus is described as a lamb or a lion.
Because that is what he's doing. That's
He is like the lion.
I don't want to say that's his function because that just sounds really, really lame. But he is being sacrificed like a lamb, or he is strong like a lion. But it's so much more than that. It's like
it's never less than. It's always more than.
It's like the original.
So
it's
if
the
you
real, not the
strip these
shadow.
away to mere physical descriptions of a creature spotted in the wild, a cryptozoologist, there he
Sasquatch.
is. Don't mess with Sasquatch. Suddenly, you have really limited the text. I'm saying that it's more. The seraphim are described as serpent-like because that's how the word is used. And it doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of that ancient culture. It was a way of saying, this is a supernatural being, and it is in the presence of God. And when they're described again later in Revelation, they're described differently. Why? I think it's because of what Martin says. This is a supernatural reality being expressed through cultural lenses.
This is a bit of what I'm going to call biblical fan fiction. What do you think that the cherubim and the seraphim's function will be in eternity? Same?
Mm-hmm.
Because in Scripture, there feels like there's a tie between humanity and Christ, and they're not or the Lord, but they're not between them, but they're Their function is one thing, but when
I think the cherubim, the seraphim, reflect the glory and the nature of God.
and they will do that through eternity.
For always, just as the heavens declare the glory of God, and mankind is supposed to do that. I think that the world of the supernatural is infinitely more rich than we think it is. And boiling it down just into like, I don't know, like a mammal's guide to North America, you know, kind
like
of
a job
thing,
description. This
Yeah.
is who I am, and this is what I do, and you're welcome.
Is to treat that being overly simplistically.
I know that, I think we talked about this earlier, maybe during one of our resets here, that the song, Holy, 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 is one of my very, very favorite songs. I know we sang it somewhere on our trip, and it was echoing whatever building we were in, and it was just, I love it so much, and that was just one of my favorite times I've ever sang it. And every time when Martin was reading and I'm reading, I love those lyrics so much.
Well, it is beautiful. It's intended to be. And it's given in the mouth of creatures whose voice shakes the very throne room. This episode has been uncomfortable for me because I'm trying to describe something that makes sense in my head and I know is weird. But the Bible is filled with weird corners. This is one of those.
Now you know how Isaiah felt.
Yeah.
He knew it in his head, but he had trouble writing it down.
So if we show up in heaven and they're like, dude, you were totally wrong. Cherubim and seraphim are not the same thing. I will say, glory, hallelujah, this is exciting. I'm just telling you that from where I'm sitting, this is weird and it's confusing. And so when I read it, I want to understand, what did the words mean to that ancient culture? And I think in the end, what you see happen is that these words point not to the beings themselves, but to the one who is on the throne.